Near Toronto's sprawling metropolis, an incredible discovery is made.
This is an Indiana Jones moment. This is huge.
A 500-year-old Huron settlement that changes our understanding of North America before European contact. It shocks the archaeologists that find it.
The most complex village ever in northeastern North America. The most number of artifacts, the largest number of longhouses. Who the heck are these people?
I've never seen anything quite like this.
But within this mystery lies another. An object is found that does not belong.
The object has a spirit.
That is very cool.
But where did it come from?
It's incredibly similar to ballistics.
And what was its impact? The answers change history.
That piece brought bad luck to my people.
One of the most extraordinary finds in North American history has just been unearthed. It is a piece of European iron, but it is found during the excavation of a Native American village that was built 100 years before contact. Its discovery has created a genuine archaeological mystery. In the year 1500, the indigenous people of North America did not manufacture iron. So how could a European object have made its way here an entire century before the Europeans arrived? And what secret is it trying to tell us? The answer lies in the incredible place in which it was found. This is the story of a revolutionary native village called Mantle, and how an iron object found its way into the hands of the people who built it. This is all that can be seen of Mantle today. But on the day it was discovered, it was a farmer's field like any other. To archaeologists Jennifer Birch and Ron Williamson, what was found here was anything but ordinary.
This is an Indiana Jones moment. This is huge. Mantle was a phone call coming into the office, and it was, Ron, you're not going to believe this. It's huge. We've got a village.
When we were out walking over the surface of this field, what we usually do is place a little flag in the ground every time we find an artifact. And so we're walking, we're placing flags in the ground, and more flags, and more flags. And all of a sudden we look behind us and just realize that the entire field was now covered with flags. And there was stuff everywhere. The material was so dense on the ground. On that day, we really knew that this site was going to be something special.
When I arrived there, I don't think I was prepared for what I saw. Immediately, I knew we had this absolutely massive village. Staring at that field and staring at all of those flags, what I was looking at in the ground I'd never seen in my career. And that's the moment that I take it from kind of that two-dimensional football field of flags, and in my mind create the three-dimensional community that was there. And in recreating kind of that scene of it as longhouses and palisade, I'm thinking, what an incredible scene this would have been 500 years ago. The people that lived in this place, who the heck are these people?
In order to find out, Ron initiates the largest archaeological dig his team has ever undertaken. And evidence of who these people were starts to emerge from the soil.
It's a castellation.
Oh.
Whoa.
To Ron, the very distinct diagonal designs on the pottery are unmistakable.
Oh my God. Right there. That might be
A similar
the similar thing. There's not a lot of difference between that and this, and you see that kind of punctate here and the punctates here.
The patterns on the pottery tell Ron that the people who lived here belonged to a group called the Wendat. Before the Europeans arrived, in a period known as pre-contact, the Wendat were one of the most prominent and powerful nations on the continent. Today, they are known as the Hurons. For the last 30 years, Ron has excavated Huron sites and is a leading authority on their history and culture.
It's an incredibly rich area.
He knows that at the beginning of the 16th century, their population was around 15,000. They lived in small villages of 300 to 400 people that were dotted along the north shore of Lake Ontario. They lived in dwellings called longhouses, and their villages were often surrounded by a defensive wall called a palisade.
I think I have something right here.
What does it look like?
I think it's a post hole. Let's just uncover it a bit more. I wonder if this is some kind of wall or something.
Look.
Ron, do you want to have a look at this?
What do you got?
I think we have a palisade.
You got a whole row?
It looks, yeah.
Wow.
The palisades were built to guard against the threat from their enemies. The Huron fought neighboring villages and other nations. At the time, the Huron were surrounded by the Algonquin to the north, the Neutral to the west, the Five Nations of the Iroquois to the south, and the St. Lawrence Iroquois to the northeast. Ron thought he understood how these people lived, but that was before Mantle.
Mantle's completely different. It is this site that, what's the saying? It keeps on giving. It is unbelievable, because I don't know from one day to the next what I'm going to find pop up on my desk or pop up from having done analysis. It just seems to be a game changer in every way.
At 10 acres, Mantle is by far the biggest site Ron and his team have ever excavated.
Ron, you're going to want to see this.
Over many months, they recover a vast array of stone axes, bone tools, and pottery.
Wow.
In the end, Ron and his team unearth a record-breaking 200,000 artifacts.
So now that we've excavated this and are frankly presented with the largest set of data we have ever encountered, the most number of artifacts from one pre-contact site, the largest number of longhouses ever on a site in northeastern North America.
Approximately 2,000 people lived in 98 longhouses, surrounded by a towering three-tiered palisade wall. All of it made from wood and built using stone tools.
Hey, Ron, take a look at this. It's a stone axe. Look at the bit is still intact. Here. Beautiful bit on this point, so polished. Created by grinding it. We find these are so important because, I mean, obviously this is pre-contact. So these are the objects that are used to cut the trees.
These people are working with stone axes. How long does it take to cut down one tree with a stone axe, let alone 60,000 trees? Let alone turning those trees into houses. 95% of what archaeologists do is trying to reconstruct what people's daily lives were like from the stuff that they leave behind. People tend to think of the native people of Canada as being this noble savage part of the landscape. When you think about a site like Mantle, 2,000 people, massive stockade around the community. A better analogy is that of a medieval town. The Mantle site, in the first half of the 16th century, was occupying the same time period as those medieval towns on the other side of the ocean. And so while the cultures are very different, the societal form really isn't.
A mysterious object was buried at Mantle, and surprisingly, its presence connects to medieval Europe. When the dig began, this was a farmer's field, so when a young archaeologist found an innocuous piece of corroded iron in a pit, she assumed it was from that farm.
I didn't see this object when the site was excavated because it was placed in a paper bag. That may sound very mundane, but that meant that it went in one stream off the site and disappeared from view for quite some time.
The object was placed in a banker's box in the basement of Ron's offices, filed alongside the tens of thousands of other artifacts waiting analysis. At this point, Ron made the real discovery.
I got a call from the lab manager, and the lab manager said there's a piece of iron that came off of one of the pits. I open the bag, I pull it out, and I look at it, and it's this piece of iron. I'm looking at this, and I just don't think this comes from that 19th century farm because it's in a beautiful context, meaning a sealed pit. Why on earth would a farmer dig a hole out in the field and bury what looks like a piece of an iron tool in that pit at that depth and then cover it back up with nothing else in the pit? That just doesn't make any sense to me. So that's why I started to look at it. I suspect that it is a hole excavated by the Huron inhabitants. I know that that's exactly a behavior that they do. And in fact, I also know that sometimes valuables are buried.
But the implications of Ron's theory are history-changing.
The whole process of forging iron is one which is a European process. It's not done anywhere on the continent at this time.
So how did the people of Mantle get hold of this object 100 years before contact?
The first recorded face-to-face interaction between Europeans and the Huron is thought to be in 1610.
1610 is the year a young Frenchman named Etienne Brulé became the first European to step foot into Huron territory.
Here we are, 1500 to 1540. We're 2 generations before that. How could this get here?
The first step to solving this mystery is to investigate the piece itself.
So if it is early 16th century, what is it? I start to imagine it's part of a blade, part of a sword. Could it be a piece of a carpenter's chisel? Could it be a planing tool? Or is it an axe? We've got some science ahead of us we have to do to figure this one out. This is a big mystery.
Ron calls on Andrea Carnevale, a research archaeologist who uses the latest technologies to take a forensic approach to problem solving.
When a question about an artifact does arise that we can't answer through basic analyses, I get to go and be sort of the bridge between the scientists and the archaeologists.
Andrea uses one of the world's most advanced digital microscopes to get a detailed look at the object.
It's a small piece that's heavily corroded. The crustaceans sort of mask the shape of this object, so we have no idea what it is. But an iron artifact is quite unique and may represent one of the earliest iron artifacts to be found. So a lot of questions arise as to where did it come from, how did it get there?
Examining the surface of the object alone isn't going to be enough to determine what this object is. She needs an X-ray strong enough to look beneath the rust.
By taking the piece and subjecting it to radiographic analysis, we can look at the manufacturing process of the piece. How was it originally manufactured?
An X-ray image of the iron will tell her how it was made. If it is cast iron, it means it is likely from the farm. But if it is wrought iron, then she can prove it is from the 16th century. Andrea and Ron have found a very powerful and precise X-ray machine, far beyond anything found in a hospital.
You got one machine or there?
It's got a couple of different machines. They're all industrial X-ray machines. I think they'll be able to reach the energy we need in order to penetrate the piece.
Team Industrial's machines are so precise, they can detect the smallest fractures in airplane engines. That can mean the difference between life and death. But today, their expertise will be used in a very different way.
Let's go do it.
All right.
My worry is that when we X-ray this, and Andrea looks at the film or the image, or the guys, they look at it and they say, yeah, nice piece of cast iron. Now, there's a difference between wrought iron and cast iron, and this piece, coming from around 1500, should be wrought iron, meaning soft, hammered, kind of process. Casting as a process, kind of pouring into a mold, didn't happen until much later, like 100 years later.
Ron and Andrea are on the verge of making a discovery that could rewrite history.
This is a big deal. Because this is the moment we're going to know. I just asked, well, you know if it's cast or rot? He said, yeah, in a heartbeat. So, in a minute, there's going to be a heartbeat, and mine will either stop beating or beat very quickly.
So we'll put that back, and we'll see what we have.
All right.
So I'm just going to save the image so we can open up and have a look at it. We looked at, just kind of gives you a general overview. We can see the scaling around the outside.
Yeah.
But,
When you say scaling, you mean
that's the rust.
corrosion.
That's the corrosion on the outside.
And
You
that
can see
white is the solid metal.
That's the solid.
So
that's all the solid
so
metal.
the big issue is this rot or cast?
Well, that doesn't look cast to me.
No, it's not porous enough to be.
Yes!
If it was cast, it would be very porous.
That does not look like a cast.
No.
Oh, yes! yes. Yes.
I think what we can do is probably.
That is so cool. This is George, you know, basically we've just changed history. This is an absolutely significant and astonishing find. It is the earliest European piece of trade iron in the interior continent of North America.
Somehow the iron object crossed the Atlantic and traveled 2,000 kilometers inland to Mantle. And all this happened 100 years before contact. But where on earth did it come from?
You know what?
What's that?
There's something right here. There.
Yeah, I see it too.
The industrial X-ray revealed that the Mantle artifact is 500 years old, making this the oldest piece of European iron ever found in the North American interior. It's a major discovery, but there's something else.
There's something right in there.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, it looks like there's potentially a little something right there.
Yeah.
Yeah, I see it.
A little bit more of that.
Ooh. Did that pop up or what?
Yeah, if you take it again, if you take a step back, there's certainly very distinctive shapes right there.
Like the line is pretty clear. It almost looks like a sideways B.
Something going to be worth stamped in, most definitely.
The fact that three of us can see it means that it's
Yeah.
probably not imagination.
Yeah, there's something there for
There
sure.
is something there.
Something stamped there, most definitely. As opposed to these areas here that are darker and lighter.
And
are
irregular.
So the stamping would
I
also.
can't talk. It's like too exciting. I mean, first the fact that it's wrought, and second that you got some kind of mark possibly.
In the 15th and 16th century, most small forges had their own distinct signature, impressed in the metal like a brand. Some were family emblems. Others had religious significance. Incredibly, if this iron piece for Mantle has a maker's mark on it, then Ron and Andrea might actually be able to find out who made it and where it came from.
We know so much more than when we walked into this place. This is absolutely amazing.
I kind of thought maybe, yeah, this was the right time for this piece to speak, tell us a story. And I think it's telling us an incredible story. We just have to listen.
There's something there.
Congratulations. Very good. I got a little bit of goosebumps right there now.
I think the beauty in the piece is the mystery. Like what's hidden behind that corrosion is what makes it so beautiful.
People often say to me as an archaeologist, what's the most exciting artifact you've ever found? You know, this might now be jumping up near the top. But it's never just about the artifact. It's about what it tells me about the people who had this artifact. How did the people think about it? In Aboriginal society, the perspective that no Western person thinks about is the perspective of the object. The object has a spirit.
How did the people of Mantle view this strange object? Why did they feel compelled to bury it? Ron turns to one of their descendants for help. He has invited Luke Lene, a member of the Huron Nation, to examine the piece firsthand.
Hi, Ron. Hey, Luke. Hey. Hey, Annette. Nice seeing you. Wow. If this turned out to be European, and early European, so meaning the 16th century, this would be the earliest European object in North America. In 510 years, you're probably the first Huron to touch that. Because as you know, once the Jesuits get here and the Europeans get here, it's only 20 years. It's like in one generation, your population goes from 30,000 to 12,000. This might be the object that arrives on an ancestral Huron site first that portends that coming disaster.
The arrival of the Europeans had a devastating effect. In the early 17th century, the Jesuits brought Christianity as well as influenza, smallpox, and measles.
Close to 80% of our 40,000 people died. And this, within one generation or two max, we were disseminated by the diseases. And at the time, we didn't know what was happening, because even our medicine men, they couldn't do anything. And our elders, nobody could understand what was happening. Very strong men or women, they were dying like flies during winter. When I see it, I have the impression that peace, brought bad luck to my people. And a kind of, a terrible spell on my people. We are looking for so many answers, and probably we have some here.
Today, only a few thousand Huron live in Canada. Shortly after disease swept through the Huron community, they fled for Quebec and still live there in a small reservation outside of Quebec City called Wendake. Luc Linné acts as the liaison between the Huron and the archaeologist in Ontario. He's made it his mission to help the Huron people regain their past.
Fully, the Europeans say, do we really need the Indian? They saw us like inferior. They said, we're a lot better, we're a lot smarter. We will not kill them all, but we have to assimilate them so they will become good Canadians.
Assimilation wiped out almost everything about them. Their culture, traditions, even their language.
We have to reconnect, with our past, to know who we are.
And with no records to guide the Huron, archaeology is now the only way to discover the truth.
In other parts of the world, you have monumental architecture, you have murals that might be painted on them, you have hieroglyphics. Whereas here, working without written history until at least the European presence, the archaeologist has to rely on those small pieces that are in the ground, or those small stains that are in the ground, that we have to recreate the three-dimensional picture of what life was like.
A perfect round dark spot called a post mold now marks where each wooden post once stood. As the post rotted over time, darker topsoil spilled into the holes and left behind a connect-the-dots-like pattern for the archaeologists to trace. They can now see the layout of each longhouse in the whole village. But when Mantle is mapped out, it looks as though there are houses on top of each other. An architectural firm has agreed to turn this two-dimensional image into a 3D model to help Ron and Jennifer untangle the mess.
Man, it's really dense, isn't it?
I've never really got a sense of scale. In all my years in professional archaeology, I've talked about this, but I've never seen it in this kind of 3D sense.
We've never found a village this complicated. When you look at it as a whole, it has these 98 houses that look like they've been dropped in there like pickup sticks. Which of those houses came first? What's the order in which they were constructed? Because you just look at it, and you know that not all of those houses could have been there at one time.
Ron and Jennifer want to see what Mantle originally looked like. They remove the longhouses they believe were built later.
So kill the other two that overlap with that one.
Yeah. Turn off House 9
And 10B.
and 10B and just leave House 10A.
Boy, we have a village.
We do.
We have a village.
Very well
emerging.
planned village.
The thing about Mantle that's so startling, it's like a perfect row of houses around a plaza. And what that taught us is that there was actually, I can see the council, the leaders of the community getting together and planning this community, like urban planning.
Manil's level of organization is greater than any village that came before it.
The parents and grandparents of the people who lived at Mantle. These guys started out 100 years previously living in very small villages that maybe had a population of 300, 350 people, maybe living in 4 longhouses.
Eventually, the Huron built slightly larger villages, but still they lacked Manil's size and design.
When they decide to pick up and move to Mantle, they decide that instead of living in small house groups, they're going to have one completely organized layout of the settlement in this radial pattern that we're seeing here.
Each 100-foot longhouse is parallel to the next and radiates out from a central square, a design similar to a European town of the same period.
They're not thinking about each other as groups of diverse people. They're now thinking of themselves as one people.
Its size, design, and organization are what make Manil unique. At some point in the life of the village, the iron object was buried. If it was buried in the early phase, it would be in the square, but if it was buried later, there was a longhouse on the site. The significance of the object changes if it was buried in a public or in a private place.
Okay, so we got a 10 by 10 square.
Oh, wow. What's interesting, Jen, is that just with that, I can easily see
300-400 people.
300 or 400 people.
Totally.
If it's the plaza, there's probably lots of people watching. And it would be ridiculous to think that that's just about throwing it away.
When you make it public, it becomes a rallying point for the community. It becomes something that integrates people. It's a shared experience that helps foster a community identity.
If the object was buried in the square, it was a rallying point. But if it was buried in a private place, it may have had a very different meaning.
The interesting thing is that a ritual act like that could have been private, especially if it's something that's you want to bury.
A private burial in a longhouse leads Ron to believe the object was seen as evil.
There's a tradition of burying objects that are troublesome at the very bottom center of the pit. I don't think, based on the archaeological context, it's put there to be retrieved. I think it's put there to stay there. If that's the case, then it has to relate to House 28 or House 29, which is part of the later phase. Which house is that in?
It's in House 29.
House 29 is dead center in the village.
So let's look at the question of, does this have a spirit to it that is unknown, that is in some way defined as troublesome? It's in the context of people not having met Europeans. They've heard maybe the foggiest notion of it. It's like, we don't really know what this object is. We don't really understand it. We think it's those people. We don't know much about those people. I suspect that anything associated with those people initially is viewed with deep suspicion.
Life at Mantle when the iron object arrived is coming into focus. This village and its way of life are unlike anything Ron Williamson and his team have ever encountered.
We're writing a history of these people right now. The same way we talk about the history of everyone else in the world. We want to know, what was the day-to-day life of a Roman? The Huron want to know, what was the day-to-day life of the occupant of the Mantle site? You have to clothe people. You have to feed people. How do you do that? What are they eating?
500-year-old teeth found on the site can help answer this question. The details of what this person ate remain locked in the enamel.
Bones have stories to tell us. They're speaking to us. We have to listen. And the Huron are listening very carefully.
You know, it's like when you have a big box and, in the box you have all the secrets of the family, but you don't have the key or the code to open the box. Finally, archaeology and the new technologies today will finally help us to open the box and to find answers to our questions.
Ron sends the teeth for scientific testing at the University of Cape Town, South Africa. Lead scientist, Dr. Judith Seeley, uses chemical analysis to extract the details of what a person ate and drank from their teeth. She makes a surprising discovery.
Hi, Judy.
She discovers an unprecedented level of corn or maize in their diet.
The value you thought came out of that was around 62% of the diet. Maize. That's fairly high. 62% is a sizable proportion of the diet.
This is getting up towards as much maize as anybody ever has eaten anywhere.
We have people where 62% of their diet is corn, which means thousands of acres of corn just to feed at that level. That's a great way to learn about the agriculturalists that these people were. They were the first farmers of the North.
Women harvested the corn. It was then ground into meal, which allowed it to be stored for long periods. The cornmeal was mixed into soup and baked into bread.
Then we need at least a year's corn in case there's crop failure due to drought. Then we need corn for trade. So there's a lot of corn moving about the landscape as trade for skins, but all these other material coming in. And now also an early European piece of trade iron, which comes into this site. You begin to see that that's all part of one story.
They traded the corn for things they needed, like animal skins and other materials, and maybe even for the iron object. But if trade brought the iron object to Mantle, where did it come from? Andrea's search hasn't brought her any closer to the answer. All she has to go on is a small box-shaped mark. No one in the archaeological world has ever attempted what she is trying to do.
I can see this being a maddening experience because it is new. It's something never researched before. To my knowledge, nobody has looked at marks on tools from this time period at such an early date. I need to be able to identify what we're calling our little top hat, our line with a little square over it, to be able to say, okay, our tool came from here.
Records for valuable metal items made of gold and silver made in Europe are relatively easy to find. But records for iron are virtually non-existent.
So finding a starting point and jumping off, I'm sure, is going to lead to a whole bunch of different avenues to go down, and each and every one of those will have to be investigated.
But so far, she can't even pinpoint the country of origin. It could have been aboard any one of the French, English, Spanish, Portuguese, or Dutch vessels known to have crossed the Atlantic in this period. She now has the daunting task of figuring out where in Europe it came from. Only then will she have a hope of solving the mystery of how the axe got to Mantle.
I become obsessed, and I need to find out everything. It's not my personality to leave something unanswered. I need an answer.
Armed with the information from the teeth analysis, Ron and Jennifer return to the architectural firm. Having discovered that Mantle's inhabitants relied so heavily on corn for food and trade, they want to know how much corn needed to be planted to sustain the village.
The question is, if you've got 1,500 people and they need a pound of corn per day, so in a simple week, it's like 10,000 pounds of corn.
Right.
So what does that mean for the field systems? 1,500 people, we're talking about thousands of acres.
For a sense of scale, they place Mantle over a modern map of Toronto.
I've centered Mantle right at Yonge and Dundas.
Perfect.
So you can get a better idea.
Then the cornfield that would have surrounded Mantle is overlaid on the map.
Where does that take us?
Whoa! These cornfields completely consumed downtown.
Entire forests were felled to make way for the cornfields. The data suggests it would have covered an incredible 80 square kilometers, enough to cover the downtown core of the world's largest cities.
Oh my goodness.
That's a lot of corn.
That actually leaves me absolutely stunned, because that puts it in a modern context. That is what people were doing daily to feed themselves. Corn at Mantle. That's the size.
I honestly don't think that I have ever walked that far.
Imagine in your mind, you'd easily get lost in cornfields. So I don't think most people have any sense at all of the amount of corn that these people are growing. Just imagine the work on the part of the nation to do that. Men have to clear the fields, women have to plant the crops, that has to be tended, has to be harvested. This is planning of a degree of complexity that equals today.
But this rapidly advancing society was not fated to last.
People often ask me, what would have happened with these cultures had they not been interrupted by European contact? What would have happened to their society? What's the natural destiny of the Huron? And the answer to the question is, I don't know. I can't know, because that contact happened. And it forever changed the Huron world, and it forever changed our world. It seems that the Western world has never been able to leave people alone to reach their natural destiny.
News of Mantle and the iron object has reached the Huron. Luc Lanay has called a meeting with the Grand Chief, Conrad Suey, Chief Gaetian Suey, and Heather Bastien, a Huron elder, to tell them what he's learned.
Most amazing is what have been shown, by Dr. Williamson. When they dug the site, they found a little piece of iron was buried in the middle of the village. We believe, more tests will be done, but we believe that piece of iron comes from Europe. Imagine this was before, the contact, of the Huron what we know. So it means that it brings up, many questions. Where is that piece coming from, and how did we get it, and why did we bury it?
To involve the Huron, that nation, there might be still lots of work to do, but at least now we feel that we are involved. We feel that we are considered. We feel that we are participating to a collective of some kind,
Just a little piece of iron, what it can do.
Yeah.
It's like a key to open the door, and a huge door, but you have a little key and it opens the door. So maybe our people at the time believed that this was a kind of a spell, to bring, I don't know, maybe bad luck, because we know today the history, with all the diseases, the war, and the impact on our population and our confederation.
We have to continue this work. I don't know how long I'll be able to continue, but anyway, it has to be done.
In Toronto, Andrea has hit a wall. Searching for the origins of the iron object is proving to be a challenging undertaking.
There are so many avenues of research I now need to follow. I'm a little overwhelmed. I feel some sort of connection to this piece. I feel that it has a story to tell, and I want to be the one who helps tell that story.
It's hard to know where to search for a matching maker's mark if Andrea doesn't even know what the object is. She switches tactics. She must first figure out what the iron piece is.
Know that this thing's real. It's just a whole lot more work.
She travels with Ron to the Rochester Museum and Science Center, which houses a large collection of 16th century European iron.
The reason for going to Rochester is to meet with Dr. Jim Bradley. He has a lot of experience with sites that are from the early contact period and the types of artifacts that come off of these sites. In particular, he's got a lot of experience with metal, and there are a number of artifacts down there that may be similar to our iron object.
The first thing we want to do is obviously show you the object. Let's look at the piece.
That is very cool. We look at this and say, oh, what a really cool but very cruddy looking object. When that was in use, that was silver. That was shiny. That was way cool.
Dr. Bradley brings out a collection of similar-looking metal objects excavated from Iroquois villages dating to half a century later than Mantle.
Let me show you what I think that probably was derived from. Here's a complete axe. This, again, is one generation later. But you can see that if you took the socket off,
Right.
and actually if you just scored a piece of this blade,
Right.
you'd have that.
And you can see how you could get multiple pieces from
Sure.
the same one.
Yeah.
Even something as robust as an iron axe can be split into multiple pieces if it is scored repeatedly with a sharp stone. But if the mantelpiece was once part of an axe, why break it apart?
I think there's often the perception that when the first Europeans showed up, Indians said, "Oh, axes! We've waited thousands of years for an iron axe." And in fact, they had perfectly good axes. They had stone axes.
Yeah.
So when they got the first iron axe, they looked at it and said, "Gee, what do we do with this?" Well, they'd cut it up and they'd make it into
their own.
Into their own, exactly. This was an aesthetic. I mean, this has had as much value for its look, and you can see that this one is actually quite comparable to yours.
It's wonderful to see this in this form.
And Indian eyes would have seen it very differently than we see it.
After the discussion with Bradley and seeing the process of how an axe is scored and snapped off to create one of these pieces that is similar in shape to ours, I'm more and more convinced that our piece is definitely from an axe.
Knowing this, Andrea can now focus her search for the maker's mark. Ron turns his attention back to Mantle. Back at the lab, analysts wash and meticulously catalog the 200,000 artifacts. They notice pottery that has never shown up before on a Huron site. Haunting face effigies and exotic designs are appearing in droves. But what's even stranger in this collection is what's missing. Over the span of his career excavating Huron villages, Ron has discovered evidence of violence. In the villages that existed during the 50-year period before Mantle, bones were found that showed signs of torture, sacrifice, and scalping. But surprisingly, at Mantle, those bones are missing.
One of the mysteries that we're trying to unravel actually extends beyond just the Mantle site. At about 1450 AD, we see this period of widespread warfare. These villages are surrounded by huge palisades, and we find scattered and butchered bits of human bone. And you can imagine what it must have been like living at a time where everyone's fighting and attacking one another. There must have really been this definite culture of fear at that time. So we're still trying to figure out what started this period of widespread warfare. It's not inconceivable that a single event sparked this conflict and then snowballed.
The archaeological evidence for this 50-year period of violence can be found as far west as Michigan, as far east as Montreal, and south into New York State. In every forest for thousands of miles around the Great Lakes, there was bloodshed. Archaeologists call this period the Dark Times.
When skirmishes were happening during this very dark period of violence, it would be exactly at a moment like this, when you could find a few people alone away from the main village, that they would be attacked in this period of ambush. That's the strategy that folks used during that period. An event could have happened right here.
Even though these skirmishes were small, the violence was widespread. It extended far beyond Huron territory and involved other nations.
Historically, we know that the Huron and the Iroquois were not only at odds, they were mortal enemies.
I really like to use the analogy of World War II for talking about this. That war started by a conflict between two nations. And subsequently, other nations got drawn into the conflict. You have alliances made, enemies defined, lines drawn between axes and allies. And it's not inconceivable to think that you have the same thing happening here in the Iroquoian world, where a single conflict between two communities snowballed and drew in all of the other nations in the lower Great Lakes at the time.
For 5 decades, people were tortured, sacrificed, burned, and beheaded.
By the time of Mantle, it doesn't happen. So, what is that about? Some people might say, well, obviously go to Wendake and sit down with the Huron and learn about that. And it's not that easy.
In fact, it's the other way around. Ron is teaching the Huron about their history. He's invited Luke to the Department of Anthropology at the University of Toronto because he wants to show Luke some pieces of his ancestors' past.
So one of the questions we have is, why did all of those small villages come together to form a larger site, a larger village like Mantle? The period just before Mantle, there's lots of human bone on the sites. So this is a lower vertebrae. And it has a bone projectile point.
Wow.
That has come in and shot right through
Wow.
the vertebral body.
I believe this is enough to kill anybody, yeah?
Is this possibly the end of a spear, or is it only the end of an arrow? But whatever, you're right. It's done with huge strength, and it's actually pierced the person. These are all fingers that are burned. We found 2 sides. These were taken off of a cranium. They were polished and they were drilled. Holes were drilled in them, and I believe they were making a rattle. Now, if you just look at this in the light the right way, and they're carving it into the bone to tell the story of the captive. This person right here, you have 2 legs and a body. It stops. He doesn't have a head. And they've created this rattle out of his head.
To touch it. To say, well, maybe tonight before going to bed, I will say, you know what? In my hands, I had the skull of one of my ancestors, and it gives me a goosebumps when I think about it.
When we look at this bone, the scattered, thousands of pieces of scattered human bone, cut, charred, and all of these artifacts that are made out of human bone that peak during this period between 1450 to 1500. And at the beginning of that period, people are living in small 1.5 to 2 acre sites with 4 or 5 longhouses. And at the end of the period, they're living in big palisade complexes with 50 houses.
So was it for security reasons?
And that's why Jennifer and the team, Andrea, that's how we view Mantle now.
These smaller communities banded together for security. A palisaded 50-house community like Mantle is far safer than scattered 4-house villages. Mantle's sheer size and population made it almost a superpower of its day, and perhaps its very presence quelled the violence. Peace allows other nations to arrive at Mantle.
There are other people who were visiting the site, who were there frequently, and they've left their mark in the archaeological record. For example, what we have found is parts of pots, that have modeled faces in them.
Are they Hurons?
These are Iroquois.
Wow.
But what is Iroquois pottery doing on a Huron site?
Where did they come from? How did they get here? All of it's one huge mystery. We can't assume anything. We have to figure it out.
There are signs in the pottery found at Mantle that the Hurons' mortal enemies have suddenly become trading partners. This bizarre twist might explain who brought the iron axe to Mantle. Ron arranges for all the exotic pottery to be laid out and invites Dr. Bill Engelbrecht to decipher it. He's an expert in Iroquois archaeology. He can identify pottery types from little more than shards. Is it possible that the pottery of the enemy made its way inside the walls of Mantle?
First of all, do we have it right?
Oh, that is amazing. These are classic Oneida and also Onondaga, their effigy faces. You really feel like they're staring at you. Whoa, what's that kind of pottery doing up in Ontario? You really have all of Iroquois nations in New York State represented. This stuff looks very Mohawk to me. This stuff looks very Seneca. To me, the effigies are a classic early Oneida and Onondaga. So a whole bunch of ceramics from different nations appearing on this one site.
Said, Mantle, we think the hostilities have ceased. There could actually be Iroquois living there.
I think you have a really interesting representation from not only the Five Nation Iroquois, but you've got St. Lawrence Iroquoian. You have people from all over. You know, I've been looking at Iroquoian pottery from the 1960s, and I've never seen such a variety. It's a big site, so it's almost like Toronto before Toronto, you know, in terms of the cosmopolitan nature. Yeah, I've never seen anything quite like this.
All the evidence from Mantle points to a social revolution. Enemies become trading partners, and Mantle marks the beginning of a time of peace and commerce.
You see this redefinition of the socio-political or geopolitical order, not unlike the formation of NATO and the United Nations, where after these hostilities decline, you're faced with an entirely new world order. And the Mantle site would have played a very important role in that new world order.
The explosion in trade could have brought visitors from afar bearing gifts.
The very fact of the cosmopolitan nature of Mantle allows us to easily accept the introduction of the iron piece as almost natural for Mantle because it's this center. It's this place where we expect people will have paid homage or indeed have taken an incredibly important object and brought it to Mantle and to an important person at Mantle.
But who brought the axe? The Iroquois nations from the south? Or the St. Lawrence Iroquois from the east? Or was it someone else?
What's the most likely way that it gets him? The one that I would favor is that it comes from the St. Lawrence Iroquois along the St. Lawrence River and into Mantle.
And the St. Lawrence River is a direct artery to the Atlantic, where you could find Europeans who had just started to venture to the New World. In the early 16th century, there were only a few documented voyages to North America. Among them are some celebrated options. Christopher Columbus, who came from Spain and landed in the Caribbean in 1492. John Cabot sailed from England to Newfoundland in 1497. And Giovanni Verrazzano left France and landed in New York Harbor in 1524. But there were also countless undocumented ships that sailed to plunder the rich fishing grounds of the Grand Banks, or the even richer promise of gold further south. With so many possibilities, the only way of finding out is through the Maker's Mark. After weeks of searching, Andrea might have a breakthrough with the Maker's Mark.
I came across some research that led me to start looking at the Spanish as a producer of iron. In doing that, I came across this incredible journal where they had up a private collection of artifacts from Basque Country.
The hills of northern Spain have been mined for iron since Roman times. The Basques have always been famous for their ironwork.
As I was flipping through their images and just expanding the images and looking at the tools themselves, I opened this one image of a meat cleaver, and there was the mark. There it was, staring right back at me on the screen. I have it.
When Andrea said to me, I found the mark, I went, what do you mean you found the mark? It seems to be a Basque mark, and I went, a Basque mark? And then she showed me the actual mark on another object, and it does look exactly like our mark. And I'm thinking, wow. So that opens up a whole series of avenues.
Ron travels to Newfoundland to meet with world-renowned archaeologist Dr. Jim Tuck, the leading expert on the Basque presence in North America. The Basques weren't only expert blacksmiths, they were among the most skilled whalers and fishermen in Europe. By the 16th century, overfishing in the Bay of Biscay had forced the Basques to brave the treacherous waters further west, where the oceans were teeming with cod and whale. In the 1970s, Dr. Tuck excavated many of the 20 Basque whaling stations discovered in Red Bay, Labrador, on the Strait of Belle Isle.
Jim Tuck is I call him probably the dean of Canadian archaeology. And if there's one person who knows about Basque archaeology, it would be Jim.
Ron's question for Dr. Tuck is simple.
Tuck, it's Ron Williamson.
Hello, Ron. Come in and sit here.
When did the Basques first arrive on the East Coast? Is it early enough to explain the Axe's presence?
Every time I look at this, it's like, well, this object got in here somehow. And it's a stunning story. I have this suspicion that this thing is a Basque piece that's made its way into Huron area by, 1530. The obvious question is, that's before the heat of the Basque trade, right?
Well, it started about 1510. The trade did, so it's no surprise that there was iron on the Strait of Belle Isle by the very early 1500s. Whaling was begun and fishing along the Strait of Belle Isle, and again in the very early 1500s. It's hard to say how many ships might have been involved, but if you've got a dozen or so ships, they could leave behind an awful lot of stuff.
Basque whalers came to Labrador in the spring and set up temporary whaling stations for the summer. When Dr. Tuck excavated the stations at Red Bay, he found pieces of iron tools discarded when the whalers sailed home for the winter. The axe must have then found its way into native hands.
Who was it?
There were native people around that area, small N native people. We don't really know who they were, or what they called themselves. I think they sort of vanished somewhere in the late 16th century. I don't think they came to hunt seals. I think they came to get European goods that were at the abandoned Basque sites at that time, I suppose. If you were there in the winter, it was
in
like,
the winter, they
or spring and fall. It'd be like a supermarket, but no checkout. So I think they probably were attracted by Europeans and the good stuff that they had, iron tools and nails and whatever that they had never seen before. These are wonderful things.
So this group who lived there would be there in the early 16th century.
Yeah.
And maybe they would have traded it to St. Lawrence Iroquois.
Oh, very likely. There must have been some exchange between these two groups.
The Basques may well have brought the axe to Labrador, where it came into the possession of a local native group. They then traded it to the St. Lawrence Iroquois. From there, it journeyed down the St. Lawrence and into Mantle. It's enough evidence to send Andrea to Spain to find a matching mark.
If you go to Spain or San Sebastian, wherever you're going, you should try and get in touch with Michael Barkham, who was at Red Bay, and is pretty good on this sort of tools and material culture stuff as well.
Okay.
Andrea heads to Basque country. If she can identify the mark on the axe, it will be the oldest North American object traced back to its European origin. 500 years after the axe arrived at Mantle, Andrea has brought it back across the Atlantic. She hopes to prove that it came from this small province in the north of Spain. Basque expert Dr. Michael Barkham has agreed to help her.
Hola.
Hola, Andrea. Good morning. How are you?
Morning. How are you?
Nice to meet you.
I have extremely high hopes that we will be able to see a collection where there are physical artifacts to look at with these marks on them. I want to be able to have one of these tools in front of me and be able to see firsthand, not just through a photograph, what these marks actually look like.
Incredibly, Barkham thinks he knows where there's another tool with the same maker's mark.
It'll be interesting to see if there are other marks on them to learn more too about where those tools came from.
Their search takes them to a small museum hidden in the Basque countryside. In a place known as the Iron Mountain, where iron ore has been mined since the 11th century.
I am incredibly nervous and incredibly excited. I think it's just now hitting me that in a couple of moments I'll be able to make that final connection that this piece of ours from the Mantle site actually did come from Basque country. If the marks don't match, obviously I'll be disappointed. I can't believe doing all this research for months on end that it would end that way. I want to believe that we'll find that mark. So here's our artifact. Traveled quite a distance now.
Little did it know that almost 500 years later, the piece was going to be traveling back to Europe. So it's remarkable. So this iron has survived almost 500 years buried, and the soil had. So it's extraordinary. Yeah.
The conditions on the site are good enough that.
For the preservation of metal. Remarkable.
So corrosion moves very slowly.
Yeah. It could well have been made from iron ore from up here in the mountains.
Here's our symbol. It's close to what the bit would be, where the bit is.
The beveled edge, yeah.
So that beveled edge is right here.
Yeah.
Here's our symbol.
So here they are. You do the honors. You've come all this way to see them.
This is exciting.
They've given us a selection.
Yeah, there's quite a range in these. It's great.
Any number of rare 16th century tools in this collection could have made their way to the New World.
This is the piece I think that you've been willing to see.
That's incredible. That is incredible. That's it. There's our mark. That's it.
I give you shape and light is different. Yeah.
Yeah, you can see the line.
Right.
Comes up. There's our little square. It's our mark. It's the one that's there in the X-ray. Just to be holding it after so many months and seeing it firsthand, that is an intentional mark. It wasn't an illusion in the way in which the photo was taken, or it's there. It's incredibly thrilling to hold this piece. I'm at the beginning of the journey. This is where this piece started out. It was manufactured in Basque Country.
Andrea has found the place where the iron axe was forged. An incredible achievement. This is now the oldest North American object to ever be traced to its European origin. Now, can the writings of a Basque fisherman from the 16th century tell them which port the ship may have launched from? Now that Andrea has confirmed that the marks match, Dr. Michael Barkum takes her to the coastal town of Hondarribia. Here, the connection to what the Basques knew as Terra Nova, the New World, is so important that images of whalers are etched in the very stone walls that surround the medieval town. Hondarribia is a heavily fortified port town that in the early 16th century, as fate would have it, was about the same size as Mantle. Dr. Barkum has tracked down rare documents that include an actual interview with a fisherman conducted 500 years earlier in the very place that Andrea and Michael sit today.
But these are a remarkable set of documents. In fact, it's one document that's very little known. They were written in Hondarribia, right in this area. These are the actual documents. They are sworn, they take oaths to tell the truth, and then the notary writes down their depositions, their testimony. And it begins, the first witness, and they start off, you see, in La Villa de Fuenterrabía, which was the old name for this town, on the 23rd of the month of September of our Lord. He talks about a voyage he'd done to the Strait of Belial area. He's asked about what the native inhabitants are like in that region, and he says, and this is what's very exciting, those Europeans who go there take all kinds of ironware, and the Indians gave them deer and wolf skins in exchange for axes and knives and other small items. And for your Mantle iron object, I mean, this is a clear documentary link.
It's spectacular that they actually mention axes and knives in this historic document. It's spectacular.
The stories involved, quite extraordinary, I think, the meeting of two different worlds.
Right. So you have this interaction between, this beautiful walled city here and this incredible walled village in Ontario.
Connecting these two worlds is a small piece of iron, an omen of what was soon to come.
We're at a moment now where we've, if you like, brought all the clues together. It's a story that is so absolutely important and significant to the Huron that Not only do I want to do it, but I feel a responsibility to sit with Luke and tell him so that he can go back to council and tell them about this important piece at Mantle. Sometime in the first 2 decades of the 1500s, in this Basque coast of Spain, this piece is made a piece of iron, which originated as an axe forged in the Basque coast of Spain. It makes its way across the ocean to the Strait of Belle Isle.
How will you explain that this axe, can, get to this point, It's such a long distance, and at the time around 1510 or 1520.
We have Aboriginal groups here. These people are very familiar with the Basque and are raiding the winter stations and taking whatever the Basque leave behind when they go back to Europe for the winter, and then trade it with the St. Lawrence Iroquois. The piece is here. It's cut. It makes its way down the St. Lawrence into the North Shore Lake Ontario, into the Mantle site.
Amazing.
This little piece, what a massive story it's got to tell.
Why did they bury it? This axe, means bad luck or something like this, and we have to get rid of it. At the time, the Hurons, we thought that there was spirit all over, with the trees, with the plants, with the animals. So maybe we thought that there was a very particular spirit in this one, and we couldn't really understand or manage it, and probably at one point we got a little bit scared about that piece and said, let's get rid of it and bury it.
I'm more inclined to think like you, that it was buried for a purpose, in a ceremony, to be left there forever.
We know, what it brought to our people. Years after, we all know the story now today, especially with the diseases. And this was almost destroy, my entire nation.
It's almost as if it's predicting what's coming, within a century.
And I guess my people at the time, they said, well, there is no way to escape, it's really coming, and we will have to face it,
Absolutely.
Kind of a prophecy.
The excavation phase at Mantle is complete, but Ron's work continues. 30 kilometers away, an older Huron village has just been discovered. Luke and the council decide that the next generation of Huron should learn firsthand what their world was like before contact. They make the 10-hour journey from Quebec to their ancestral homeland in Ontario to take part in the new dig.
C'est une journée qui est historique. On revient dans l'histoire. Quand je vous disais tantôt, il y avait des jeunes de votre âge qui étaient ici il y a plusieurs centaines d'années. Et on va marcher sur les mêmes traces. C'est un lieu qui est important. C'est un symbolique extrêmement grand pour nous, pour notre nation.
The archaeologists are going to set up. They're going to set the screens up. The archaeologists will point out to you what the artifacts are. This is a tremendous moment for us. We're really, really happy you're here.
This means something to me and to my people. We were sophisticated people. We were not like, when I was younger, I was taught, that we were only savages and pagans. Because of archaeology, it opens so many possibilities to learn about the history.
Oh, look at that. Nice.
And also for my own people, that to have this kind of a self-esteem. Not only as individual, but as collective, as a nation.
500 years after Mantle revolutionized the Huron world, a subdivision sits in its place. And although there is nothing left of it to see here, its story has left a permanent mark on world history. Before returning to Wendake, the council traveled to Mantle to lay to rest part of their turbulent history.
The people on Earth, they are a member of the Sacred Circle too. And for us, it's very important carry a little pouch that contains bear claw, sage, tobacco to protect the site and the people who are here. For us, the bear means medicine, health, power.
As important as this iron piece is in casting the first shadow of that European presence in the New World, because it's 100 years, almost to the decade from Mantle, that we see the first face-to-face meeting that we know of between a Huron and a European, and that occurs between Etienne Brulé and a Huron in 1610. That's a moment of direct contact that within 20 years leads to decimation of the population. Hugely symbolic event in the history of the Huron nation and in European history. What's going through that guy's mind as he meets Brulé? You can imagine that one of the thoughts in his mind is, I knew you were coming. And from that moment on, the world changes.